At the pinnacle of his new life, with his perfect new partner Sienna glittering on his arm, Lionel Dawson believed he had orchestrated his own happiness. He stood before the city's elite at a lavish charity gala, held in the very house he once shared with his ex-wife, ready to deliver the speech that would cement his success. But he never finished that first sentence, because the grand oak doors swung open and the woman he had callously discarded a year ago walked in. This was not the broken, weeping Marina he'd left behind. This woman was transformed, radiating a steel-like confidence he'd never seen before. And she was holding a secret in her arms that was about to burn his meticulously constructed world to ashes. The silence in their Boston brownstone was a new phenomenon. For 7 years, the home of Lionel and Marina Dawson had been filled with the low hum of contentment, the scent of old books from Marina's study, the sound of classical music drifting from the living room speakers, the clinking of wine glasses as they dissected their days. Lionel was a rising star at Price & Dawson Architecture, a firm he'd built from the ground up with his best friend, Robert Price. Marina was a respected art historian, a consultant for museums and private collectors, her mind as beautiful as the canvases she studied. Their life was a curated masterpiece. The first crack appeared as a hairline fracture almost invisible. It was Lionel's phone, which was suddenly always face down on the nightstand. It was the late nights at the office, blamed on a demanding new skyscraper project in the Seaport district. "The client is brutal, Marina," he'd say, kissing her forehead, his lips feeling strangely cool. Just a few more weeks of this grind. Marina, who had always trusted him, implicitly chose to believe him. They were trying for a baby, after all. The stress of that journey with its scheduled appointments and emotional roller coasters was a strain on them both. She reasoned that he was throwing himself into his work as a coping mechanism. She'd double her efforts to be the perfect supportive wife. She'd have his favorite meal, a slow-braised lamb shank, ready when he stumbled in at 10 p.m., smelling of the crisp night air, and something else, something faintly floral and unfamiliar. The fracture widened the day she stopped by his office, unannounced, with coffee and pastries. She walked into the sleek glass-walled reception area and was greeted by a young paralegal. "Oh, Mr. Dawson is in a client meeting," the woman said, her eyes darting away for a split second too long. But Marina could see into Lionel's office from where she stood. It was empty. His jacket was gone. "That's strange," Marina said, her voice light betraying none of the cold dread coiling in her stomach. "He told me he was swamped here all day." The paralegal offered a weak, practiced smile. He must have just stepped out. That evening, Lionel came home with a lavish bouquet of her favorite peonies. "A peace offering," he announced, his smile too bright. "For being so absent lately. I landed the final approval on the Seaport Tower. We're celebrating." He was charming, attentive, and utterly convincing. As he poured the champagne, Marina felt a wave of guilt for her earlier suspicion. He was working hard for them, for their future family. How could she have doubted him? They made love that night, with a desperation that felt less like passion and more like a farewell. The end came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday. It was clinical, brutal, and efficient. Marina was arranging a new collection of antique maps in her study when Lionel walked in. He didn't sit down. He stood by the door, his hands shoved into the pockets of his tailored trousers, looking like a handsome stranger in their home. "Marina, we need to talk," he began, using the tone he reserved for difficult clients. "Okay," she said slowly, putting down a 17th century map of Paris. "You look serious." "I'm leaving you." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Marina felt the blood drain from her face. She thought she must have misheard. It was a joke, a terrible, unfunny joke. She looked at his face, searching for a tell a flicker of humor in his hazel eyes. There was nothing but cold, hard resolution. "What?" she whispered. "I've fallen in love with someone else." He said the words coming out in a rehearsed rush. "Her name is Sienna Keller. She's a junior associate at the firm. I've been seeing her for 6 months. I'm sorry, Marina. I never meant to hurt you, but I can't live a lie anymore. I've already rented a new apartment. My things are packed." 6 months. The late nights, the secret calls, the floral perfume, it all crashed down on her at once. Every lie, every excuse, every moment of her own willful blindness. She had been a fool. The pain was a physical thing, a white-hot poker searing through her chest. "Sienna Keller." Marina repeated the name, her voice trembling. A pretty ruthlessly ambitious brunette she'd met once at a company holiday party. The woman had shaken her hand, smiled a little too widely, and said, "It's an honor to finally meet you. Lionel talks about you all the time." The audacity of it stole her breath. "How could you? Lionel?" The question was a fragile, broken thing. Our life. Our home. We were trying for a baby. A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossed his face before it was replaced by a mask of impatience. "It wasn't working, Marina. We weren't working. We've been growing apart for years. We were just going through the motions. Sienna, she makes me feel alive." He didn't just break her heart. He rewrote their entire history to justify his betrayal. He turned their 7 years of love and partnership into a hollow charade. "Get out," she said, the words barely audible. "My bags are in the hall," he said, as if discussing a business transaction. "My lawyer will be in touch with yours. I want to make this as smooth as possible. Get out." This time her voice was stronger, laced with the venom of a woman scorned. He turned and walked away without another word. Marina stood frozen in her study, surrounded by the beautiful things they had collected together. She heard the front door open, then click shut. The silence that followed was no longer peaceful. It was a vast, echoing void, the sound of her world ending. She slid down the wall, the antique map of Paris crinkling beneath her, and finally let out the guttural, soul-shattering sob she had been holding back. The first contact from Lionel's lawyer, a piranha named Franklin Cole, came within 48 hours. The email was cold and concise, detailing Lionel's proposal for the divorce settlement. He would keep the firm his investment portfolio and the vacation condo in Vale. Marina would get the brownstone once the mortgage was refinanced, solely in her name, and a lump sum payment that was insultingly small a pittance for 7 years of her life and emotional investment. The subtext was clear. Take it, or I will drag you through a messy public battle you can't win. Marina felt too numb to fight. She forwarded the email to her own lawyer and tried to function moving through her house like a ghost. Everywhere she looked, she saw Lionel. His favorite armchair, the coffee mug he used every morning, the indentation his head had left on the pillow next to hers. Each object was a fresh stab of pain. Her best friend Brooke, a fiery journalist with zero tolerance for nonsense, descended on the house like a Valkyrie. She packed Lionel's remaining belongings, the books he'd left behind, the toiletries in the bathroom, his collection of single malt scotches, into boxes with ruthless efficiency. "We are performing an exorcism, Marina," Brooke declared, taping a box shut with a satisfying rip. "We are cleansing this house of his toxic cheating energy." A week later, the real horror began. Marina was scrolling numbly through Instagram when a photo posted by one of Lionel's colleagues stopped her cold. It was a group shot from a dinner party. There in the center was Lionel, his arm wrapped possessively around Sienna Keller's waist. They were standing in front of the familiar deep blue feature wall of Robert Price's dining room. Sienna was beaming, wearing a slinky red dress, looking perfectly at home amongst Lionel's friends. The caption read, "Celebrating the Seaport Tower. Win with the power couple, Lionel and Sienna. Power couple." The term was a dagger to the heart. That had been their title, a loving joke between them. It got worse. Sienna was a master of the slow, deliberate takeover. She started by subtly inserting herself into Lionel's digital life, then his social life, and finally her physical life. Photos appeared of her redecorating Lionel's new, sterile, high-rise apartment. She posted pictures of herself, having brunch with the wives of Lionel's colleagues, women Marina had considered friends. They smiled for the camera, all of them, complicit in her erasure. The final soul-crushing blow came a month after Lionel had left. Marina received a certified letter. It was from Lionel's lawyer. He was exercising a clause in the prenuptial agreement she had barely remembered signing. It stated that in the event of a separation, the brownstone, which had been purchased primarily with funds from a significant bonus Lionel received just before their wedding, was to be sold with the profits split 70-30 in his favor. He was no longer giving her the house. He was kicking her out. Brooke was incandescent with rage. "He can't do this. That bastard is trying to make you homeless." But he could, and he was. Her lawyer confirmed it was ironclad. The generous man who had insisted the house was their forever home had in reality ensured he held all the cards from the very beginning. Marina had 30 days to vacate. The process of packing up her life was a slow-motion funeral. Each box she filled was another shovel of dirt on the grave of her marriage. One rainy afternoon, as she was sorting through the linen closet, she saw a car pull up outside a sleek white Porsche. Sienna Keller unfolded herself from the driver's seat. She was with a woman Marina recognized as a high-end interior designer. They stood on the sidewalk, Sienna pointing up at the brownstone's facade, talking and laughing as the designer took notes on a tablet. Sienna glanced up, and her eyes met Marina's through the window. For a moment, her smile faltered, but it was quickly replaced by a look of triumphant disdain. She gave a small, almost imperceptible wave, a gesture of pure mockery. She wasn't just taking Marina's husband, she was measuring the drapes in her home before her body was even cold. That was the moment something inside Marina snapped. The grief and the sorrow that had paralyzed her for weeks began to curdle, hardening into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She wasn't just a victim. She was Marina Dawson, a woman who had built her own career, who had a mind and a will of her own. She would not be erased. She called her lawyer. "Forget the settlement negotiations. Don't respond to anything. Let them wonder what we're doing." "Marina, that could be risky," the lawyer advised. "Just do it." Marina said, her voice devoid of its earlier tremble. She booked a moving company for the following week. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even Brooke. She packed her most precious belongings, her books, her research photos of her parents, and a small antique silver locket her grandmother had given her. She left everything else. The furniture, the art they had bought together, the kitchen appliances. She would let them have the shell of her old life. She was taking the soul. On her last night in the house, she wrote a single short note and left it on the marble island in the kitchen. Then, before the sun rose, she got in her car and drove away from Boston, her entire life packed into a few dozen boxes in a moving truck behind her, with no destination in mind other than away. When Lionel and Sienna finally entered the house with their designer, a week later, they found it eerily empty, save for the furniture. On the kitchen island lay the note. It wasn't angry or pleading. It was just 2 words written in Marina's elegant script. You win. The first month was a blur of cheap motels and long, empty highways. Marina drove west with no plan, fueled by coffee and a gnawing emptiness. She was a ghost, haunting the back roads of America. The silence of the car was her only companion, a space where she could finally scream, cry, and let the full weight of her loss consume her. In a dusty motel in Nebraska, she got the news that her divorce had been finalized. Lionel had won by default. He and Sienna had bought the brownstone. A victory for them, a footnote in her life. She eventually found herself on the Oregon coast in a small, wind-swept town called Cannon Beach. The raw, untamed beauty of the place spoke to her weary soul. The jagged silhouette of Haystack Rock against a perpetually misty sky, the thunderous roar of the Pacific. It was a landscape that didn't demand happiness. It simply existed, powerful and enduring, and it allowed her to do the same. She rented a small cottage set back from the beach, a cozy, salt-bleached place with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out onto the ocean. She changed her number, deleted her social media, and effectively vanished. For the first time in months, she felt a sliver of peace. The anonymity was a balm. Here she wasn't Lionel Dawson's discarded wife. She was just Marina, the quiet woman who took long walks on the beach and bought her groceries at the local co-op. It was during one of those long walks, about 2 months after her arrival, that the persistent nausea and fatigue she'd been blaming on stress and a poor diet became undeniable. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the pregnancy test in the small cottage bathroom. She had been so consumed by the divorce that she hadn't even considered the possibility. They had been trying for months, a process filled with charts, timings, and heartbreaking disappointment. It had never worked. Until now, the 2 pink lines that appeared on the stick felt like a cosmic joke. She was pregnant. Pregnant with the child of the man who had shattered her life and moved on without a backward glance. The first emotion was not joy, but pure, unadulterated terror. How could she do this alone? She was jobless, emotionally shattered, and completely isolated. For a full day she sat by the window watching the tide roll in and out, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. The terror slowly gave way to a fierce, primal wave of protectiveness. This wasn't Lionel's baby, not anymore. This was her baby. This was a piece of her future that he couldn't touch, couldn't rewrite, couldn't take away. This child, this tiny, improbable life, was not a reminder of what she had lost. It was her reason to rebuild. That decision became her anchor. She started to put down roots. She found a part-time job cataloguing archives for the local historical society, a quiet, methodical task that soothed her mind. She made friends with the owner of the town's only bookstore, a warm, witty woman named Patricia. She started painting again, a hobby she'd abandoned years ago, filling canvases with the moody blues and greys of the Oregon coast. As her belly grew, so did her strength. She followed the progress of Lionel and Sienna's life from a safe distance, using a private browser on a library computer. She saw the society pages gushing about their whirlwind romance. She saw the glossy magazine spread featuring their newly renovated brownstone, Sienna posing in Marina's old study, which had been transformed into a minimalist office. Each image was a small pinprick, but it no longer had the power to shatter her. It was like watching a film about 2 strangers. 9 months after she left Boston, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy in a quiet local hospital. She named him Owen, a name with no connection to Lionel's side of the family. He had her dark hair, but to her initial dismay, he had Lionel's hazel eyes. But when she looked into them, she didn't see her ex-husband's betrayal. She saw innocence potential, and a love so profound It remade her entire world. Owen became her everything. One afternoon, when Owen was a few months old, an email appeared in the new private account she used for work. The sender was a name she hadn't seen in years, Alistair Finch, her late grandfather's estate lawyer, a man well into his 80s. The subject line read, "Urgent regarding the Dawson Marital Trust." Curious, she opened it. Alistair explained that he had been trying to reach her. He had been reviewing the trust her grandfather had established for her upon his death, a fund she vaguely knew existed, but which Lionel, with his financial acumen, had always managed. Alistair had noticed some irregularities, some recent inquiries from Lionel's lawyers that had raised a red flag. He asked if she would be willing to speak with him. They arranged a video call. Alistair was a kind, sharp-eyed man who didn't mince words. "Marina," he said, his voice crackling slightly over the connection. "Your grandfather was a very shrewd and somewhat cynical man. He adored you, but he never much cared for Lionel. He saw him as an ambitious operator." He went on to explain the trust's structure. It wasn't just a pot of money. It was a complex instrument designed to protect her and her direct descendants. The initial seed money for Price and Dawson architecture hadn't come from a bank loan as Lionel had always claimed. It had come directly from this trust. Furthermore, the deed to the brownstone was also tied to it. Lionel was the trustee, but Marina and her offspring were the sole beneficiaries. Then came the bombshell. "Your grandfather included a rather unique morality clause," Alistair said, peering over his spectacles. "He stipulated that if the acting trustee, that is Lionel, were to engage in an act of infidelity that directly led to the dissolution of the marriage, a series of events would be triggered. Full financial control of all assets, originating from the trust, would immediately revert to you, the primary beneficiary. The transfer is contingent on you providing irrefutable proof of the infidelity." Marina stared at the screen, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Alistair said, a grim smile on his face, "that your ex-husband's new life, his company's foundation and his home are all built on your grandfather's money, and according to this document, he has just defaulted on the terms of the loan. He just doesn't know it yet." For Lionel Dawson, victory tasted sweet, but the aftertaste was surprisingly bitter. He had everything he thought he wanted. He had the thriving firm, the beautiful home, and the stunning, vivacious woman on his arm. Sienna was a trophy, and he paraded her everywhere. She was brilliant at social functions, charming potential clients, and looking impeccable in couture. Their life was a whirlwind of galas, exclusive dinner parties, and weekend trips to the Hamptons. They were the city's new it couple. But beneath the glossy surface, cracks were beginning to show. The easy intellectual companionship he'd shared with Marina was absent. Conversations with Sienna rarely strayed from gossip social climbing and her endless desire for more. More jewelry, a faster car, a bigger renovation. She had an insatiable appetite for the trappings of wealth and a terrifyingly short attention span for anything that didn't directly benefit her. He found himself missing the small things. He missed discussing a foreign film with Marina over a bottle of cheap, robust red wine. He missed the way she would get lost in a book, her brow furrowed in concentration. He missed her quiet, steady presence, a warmth that had anchored him without him ever realizing it. Living with Sienna was like living with a firework, dazzling, exciting, but ultimately exhausting, and leaving you with nothing but smoke. The renovation of the brownstone became a point of contention. Sienna had ripped out all the custom-built mahogany bookshelves Marina had designed, replacing them with stark white walls to display a single ridiculously expensive piece of modern art. The cozy lived-in kitchen was gutted and replaced with a cold professional-grade steel setup that was rarely ever used for cooking. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a gallery, a showroom for their success. "It's an investment, darling," Sienna would say, waving a dismissive hand when he voiced a rare complaint. "It's about image. People see this house, they see us, and they see success. That's what brings in the billion-dollar clients." His business partner, Robert Price, was Sienna's biggest cheerleader. "She's a shark, Lionel. In a good way, she's exactly what you needed to get to the next level," Robert would say, clapping him on the back. "Marina was sweet, but she was holding you back. She was too academic. Sienna understands the game." Lionel let himself be convinced, silencing the nagging voice in his head that told him he'd made a terrible mistake. He'd blown up his life for this. It had to be worth it. The pressure mounted. To fund their extravagant lifestyle, Lionel, encouraged by Robert, began taking bigger risks at the firm. They took on highly leveraged projects, borrowing heavily against their existing assets. His once cautious financial strategy became reckless, a high-stakes gamble to keep the money flowing. One evening he was working late, reviewing the firm's finances. A file caught his eye. Dawson Marital Trust, initial capitalization. He hadn't looked at it in years. He opened it, a wave of nostalgia, and something akin to guilt washing over him. He saw the initial transfer from Alistair Finch's office, the money that had started it all. He remembered Marina's grandfather, a stern but fair man, who had looked at him with unconcealed skepticism. Lionel had worked hard to prove him wrong, to show he was worthy of his granddaughter. And how had he repaid that he scrolled through the dense legal document, his eyes glazing over the complex clauses? He stopped on a section titled Clause 12B, Beneficiary Covenants. He skimmed the impenetrable legalese about fiduciary duty and marital stability. It seemed like standard boilerplate. He closed the file, shaking off the uneasy feeling. It was his money now, his firm. He had earned it. But the ghost of Marina lingered. Sometimes late at night, after Sienna was asleep, a remote, beautiful stranger beside him in their sprawling bed, he would find himself thinking about her. Where was she? Was she okay? He'd felt a pang of something sharp and painful when she'd simply vanished, leaving only that 2-word note. He'd expected a fight-tears accusations. Her silent disappearance was more damning than any screaming match. It was a quiet judgment, an indication that he was no longer worth her time or her anger. He told himself it was for the best, a clean break. But as Sienna's demands grew more shrill and the pressure at work more intense, the memory of Marina's quiet grace and unwavering support became a constant, silent rebuke. He was living in a gilded cage of his own making, and the bars were beginning to feel cold and tight. The Foundation for Children's Arts Gala was the crowning achievement of Sienna's year-long social campaign. She had clawed her way onto the board and then ruthlessly maneuvered to have the event hosted at her home. It was her coronation as Boston's new Queen Bee. The brownstone was unrecognizable, transformed by event planners into a shimmering fantasy of white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and flowing champagne. Lionel stood beside her near the entrance, a fixed smile plastered on his face, as they greeted a procession of the city's wealthiest and most influential figures. Sienna was radiant in a silver sequined gown, her laughter sharp and bright. Lionel felt like a prop, an accessory to her ambition. "Robert is here," Sienna trilled, waving him over. "Doesn't everything look divine?" "Spectacular, Sienna. Truly," Robert said, kissing her cheek. He turned to Lionel. "Big night, my friend. After your speech tonight and the donation we're about to announce, the city contract for the new waterfront pavilion is ours for the taking." It was all connected. The parties, the spending, the gala, it was all a calculated business move orchestrated by Sienna and Robert. Lionel felt a chill run down his spine. When had his life become so transactional? Later, Sienna tapped a microphone for attention. "Everyone, if I could have your attention. It's my great honor to introduce the man whose vision is reshaping our city's skyline, my incredible partner, Lionel Dawson." Polite applause rippled through the crowded room. Lionel walked to the makeshift stage at the base of the grand staircase, his heart heavy. He looked out at the sea of smiling, predatory faces, all of them there to network and posture. He cleared his throat, ready to deliver the speech Sienna had helped him write, a speech full of empty platitudes about community and art. "Thank you, Sienna," he began. "It's an honor to welcome you all into our home tonight." He never got to the next line. At that exact moment, the large oak doors to the brown stone, which had been closed to the public, swung silently open. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. The chatter in the room, which had already begun to rise, died instantly. Every head turned. The woman stepped forward into the light, and a collective audible gasp swept through the gala. It was Marina. But it was not the Marina anyone remembered. The soft, slightly academic woman was gone. In her place stood a vision of pure, unadulterated confidence. Her dark hair was cut in a sharp, elegant bob. She wore a simple, perfectly tailored emerald green dress that bespoke quiet, old-money elegance, a stark contrast to Sienna's flashy glitter. Her face was serene, her eyes clear and direct. She looked stronger, healthier, and more beautiful than Lionel had ever seen her. She was not alone. Cradled in her arms, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket, was a baby of about 10 months, sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. The child had a dusting of dark hair and a perfect Cupid's bow mouth. Lionel felt the microphone slip from his numb fingers, clattering to the floor with a screech of feedback that echoed the scream in his own mind. The room was utterly silent, a tableau of frozen, shocked faces. Sienna's painted smile was gone, replaced by a mask of pure, venomous disbelief. Robert Price's jaw was slack. Marina's eyes scanned the room coolly, taking in the scene, the lavish decorations, the gawking guests, her ex-husband on the stage, and the woman standing beside him. Her gaze finally settled on Lionel. There was no hatred in her eyes, no pain. There was something far more terrifying, pity. She took a slow, deliberate step into the room. Then another. The soft click of her heels on the polished hardwood floor was the only sound in the cavernous silence. She walked towards the stage, her movements graceful and unhurried, a queen reclaiming her stolen kingdom. She stopped directly in front of Lionel, close enough that he could see the tiny sleeping face of the child in her arms. The baby stirred, opened his eyes, and looked up. They were a startling, familiar hazel. They were Lionel's eyes. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the cavernous room was the frantic, useless feedback from the microphone Lionel had dropped. Time itself seemed to warp and thicken every second, stretching into an eternity. From his position on the stage, Lionel saw the scene as a series of frozen, hyper-realistic paintings. He saw the flicker of avarice in one guest's eyes, the undisguised shock on another's. He saw Robert Price, his face a mask of confusion that was rapidly hardening into dread. He saw Sienna, her perfectly composed features fracturing like porcelain under a hammer. But most of all, he saw Marina. She stood there, a portrait of serene power, holding a child whose existence fundamentally rewrote Lionel's entire world. The spell shattered. The silence broke, not with a single sound, but with a tidal wave of them gasps, sharp whispers, the frantic tapping of thumbs on phone screens, as the city's elite began to broadcast the scandal of the decade. Sienna, recovering first, moved with the vicious speed of a cornered predator. Her survival instincts, honed by years of social climbing, took over. This was an attack, and it had to be neutralized. "What is the meaning of this?" she snarled, her voice dropping its musical party tone and taking on a low, dangerous edge. She took a step toward Marina, a clear gesture of territorial aggression. "Whatever pathetic, desperate stunt this is, you are not welcome here. Security!" She yelled towards the back of the room. "Escort this woman out." Marina didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge Sienna's presence, an act of dismissal, so complete it was more insulting than any retort. Her gaze remained fixed on Lionel, who was still paralyzed on the stage, his mind struggling to process the impossible reality before him. "Hello, Lionel," she said again, her voice a calm, clear bell that cut through the rising chaos. "You look surprised. I suppose I should have called first." The quiet irony in her tone was a scalpel slicing through his shock. The baby in her arms, Owen made a soft, cooing sound, his small hand reaching up to touch the emerald fabric of his mother's dress. Is he? Lionel finally managed to croak the question dying in his throat. The words were too enormous, the implications too catastrophic to fully articulate. "His name is Owen," Marina replied, her voice steady and factual, as if she were discussing the weather. "He's 10 months old. You can do the math." A fresh wave of whispers, louder this time, rippled through the crowd. 10 months. It was a precise, damning timeline. The conception had occurred in the final fraught weeks of their marriage, during the period Lionel had told himself was a loveless lie. This child was not an afterthought. He was a direct consequence of a union Lionel had callously discarded. The confirmation seemed to ignite the fury in Sienna. The truth of the timeline meant this wasn't some random child Marina had adopted for show. This was a legitimate heir, a complication of the highest order. "I don't care who he is," Sienna shrieked, her carefully constructed composure completely disintegrating. "This is a pathetic attempt to ruin our night. Get out of my house." "My house?" Marina finally turned her head, her eyes sweeping over Sienna with a look of clinical pity. "That's a very interesting choice of words. Ownership is a complicated concept, isn't it? Which brings me to why I'm really here." With a subtle, almost imperceptible nod towards the back of the room, she gave the signal. As if on cue, the crowd parted. 2 figures walked forward with an air of undeniable purpose. The first was an elderly, distinguished man with piercing eyes and a spine of steel, Alistair Finch. The second was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in a severe business suit, clutching a leather briefcase as if it were a weapon, Lionel Dawson. Alistair began, his powerful voice commanding immediate silence. "My name is Alistair Finch. I am the executor of the estate of Marina's late grandfather. This is Miss Albright, a forensic accountant. I believe it is past time you and I had a conversation regarding the specific covenants of the Dawson Marital Trust." The blood drained from Lionel's face. The trust, a file he hadn't looked at in years, a file he'd dismissed as boilerplate. He felt a cold dread, slick and oily, begin to creep up his spine. Robert Price, sensing a corporate threat far more dangerous than a mere domestic dispute, stepped forward to try and contain the situation. "Now look here," he said, attempting a placating tone. "This is a private party. I'm sure whatever this is about, it can be handled in a boardroom tomorrow." "Oh, I think it needs to be handled right now, Robert," Marina said, turning her piercing gaze on him. "Since you're so very central to the conversation." Ms. Albright opened her briefcase and passed a thick document to Alistair, who held it up. As per the Trust's specific infidelity clause, Clause 12b to be precise, he announced, his voice resonating with legal finality, upon the presentation of irrefutable proof that the marriage was dissolved as a direct result of the acting trustee's adultery, full financial and operational control of all assets originating from the trust reverts immediately and irrevocably to the primary beneficiary Marina Dawson and her direct heir. He paused, gesturing pointedly at the sleeping Owen in her arms. Sienna let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "What assets? That's ridiculous. Lionel built his firm from the ground up with his own 2 hands." "Did he?" Marina countered, her voice dangerously soft. She was no longer just a wronged wife. She was an executioner. "Ms. Albright, would you perhaps care to share what your audit of the firm's capitalization revealed?" The forensic accountant stepped forward, her expression impassive. "Our audit traced the financial origins of Price and Dawson Architecture. 100% of the initial seed capital, a sum of $2 million, was disbursed directly from the trust in question. Furthermore, the down payment for this property and all subsequent mortgage payments until your separation were also paid from trust funds. Legally, she concluded, letting the words land like hammer blows. The firm's foundational assets and this house are not and have never been personal assets of Mr. Dawson. They belong to the trust." The room erupted. This was a language every person in attendance understood: money. Lionel felt the very ground of his identity. The self-made man, the architectural genius, turned to quicksand beneath him. His entire success story was a lie. He had been playing with house money, and the house had just come to collect. But Marina wasn't finished. She let the financial shock settle for a moment before delivering the killing blow. Her eyes found Robert Price, who was now sweating profusely. "It's truly amazing what you can find out when you start digging into the finances," she said, her tone conversational, which made the words all the more chilling. "You start to see patterns. For instance, you learn about a promising junior associate named Sienna Keller, who was struggling with a rather significant amount of student loan and gambling debt. You learn how a rival firm, desperate to underbid you on the new waterfront pavilion project, might see an opportunity. How they might approach your disgruntled partner, Robert, and offer to pay off Miss Keller's debts in exchange for her services." She let the accusation hang in the air, thick and poisonous. Robert went corpse-like pale. That is a preposterous, slanderous lie," he stammered. "Is it?" Marina raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Because Miss Albright is quite gifted at following the money. She traced a series of large anonymous payments into Ms. Keller's offshore accounts, payments that originated from a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, a shell corporation that happens to be owned by your brother-in-law." It was over. The final, undeniable piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The crowd collectively turned to stare at Robert and Sienna. The betrayal was staggering in its scope. Sienna hadn't just been an affair. She was a weapon. Robert, his best friend, his partner for 15 years, the man with whom he had shared dreams and bottles of scotch, had not only condoned the affair, but had orchestrated it for financial gain. Every late-night strategy session, every congratulatory handshake, every word of encouragement had been a lie. Lionel's mind fractured. He looked at Sienna, and he no longer saw the vibrant, exciting woman he'd craved. He saw a paid actress, a stranger whose every touch and whisper had been part of a script. He looked at Robert, and he didn't see a friend. He saw a serpent who had been coiled at his side for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His success, his home, his friendship, his love, it was all a grand, hollow fraud. Alistair Finch's voice cut through his internal agony, delivering the final verdict. The trust documents are ironclad. As of this moment, Miss Marina Dawson is assuming full control of all trust assets. Lionel, you are hereby removed as trustee, effective immediately. The firm's assets are frozen, pending a full audit and restructuring under her sole direction, and you have 48 hours to vacate this property. The last vestiges of Sienna's composure shattered. The money, the status, the power, it was all tied to. Lionel was now worthless. No, she shrieked, whirling on him, her face a mask of primal greed and terror. Fix this, you have to fix this. This can't be happening. But Lionel didn't hear her. He was no longer looking at the architects of his ruin. His gaze was fixed across the room at the only real things left in it. He saw his son, Owen, who had begun to stir his small face, peaceful and innocent. And he saw Marina, the woman he had thrown away, a woman who had weathered the ultimate storm of betrayal, not by breaking, but by becoming the storm itself. She stood there, calm and victorious, holding the life he should have had, the love he had so foolishly squandered. He hadn't just lost a company or a house. He had lost everything that had ever truly mattered. The aftermath of Marina's return was not a slow decay, but an instantaneous implosion. The moment the truth detonated in the center of the room, the glittering facade of the gala shattered into a million pieces. The frantic whispers turned into a cacophony of undisguised gossip. Guests who moments before had been vying for Lionel's attention now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were sharks who had scented blood, and they were backing away from the carnage, eager to recount the story of his spectacular demise. Goodbyes were hasty air, kisses were abandoned, and the room emptied with a speed that was in itself a brutal judgment. In the ensuing chaos, Sienna rounded on Lionel, her beautiful face twisted into an ugly snarl of panic and rage. "This is your fault!" She spat her voice, a venomous whisper that was somehow louder than the surrounding din. "You and your pathetic sentimental history. I told you to crush her, to leave her with nothing." She was a corporate spy, Sienna. Lionel said the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "You were paid to do this." "I was paid to get results." She shot back, her eyes wild. "And I did. We had it all. The money, this house, the respect. And you let her walk in here and take it away. You are weak, Lionel. You were always weak." She looked around the opulent room at the wilting orchids and the abandoned champagne flutes, her gaze lingering on the life that was evaporating before her eyes. With a final disgusted look at him, she turned and stormed up the grand staircase. By the time the last caterer had cleared out in the pre-dawn hours, Sienna was gone. Her closets were empty, her jewelry box bare. She had vanished as quickly and completely as she had appeared, leaving behind only the faint scent of her expensive perfume and the deep, permanent crater she had made of his life. Lionel was left alone in the vast, echoing shell of the brownstone. The next 48 hours passed in a surreal, suffocating haze. He wandered through the rooms Sienna had so coldly curated, her minimalist aesthetic, now feeling like a monument to his own hollowness. He saw ghosts everywhere. In the study, he didn't see Sienna's sterile white desk, but the memory of Marina's beloved mahogany shelves overflowing with books that smelled of paper and time. In the kitchen, the gleaming, unused steel appliances seemed to mock the memory of shared meals of Marina's flour-dusted hands kneading dough on a Sunday morning. Every object was a testament to his catastrophic error in judgment. He had traded the authentic for the artificial substance, for style love, for an illusion of power. He had believed Sienna's ambition was a reflection of his own, when in reality it was a parasitic entity that had merely used him as a host. He had believed Robert was his friend, his brother, when he had been nothing more than a co-conspirator in his own ruin. On the final afternoon, with the movers scheduled to arrive the next morning to inventory the trust's assets, he sat down at the cold marble island in the kitchen. He thought of Marina's two-word note, "You win," and a wave of profound shame washed over him. She hadn't been surrendering. She had been letting him hang himself with the rope he'd so eagerly fashioned. He took out a single sheet of paper and a pen. He didn't write to make excuses or to beg for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. He wrote to confess. He filled the page with the truth of his weakness, his ego, his monumental foolishness. He apologized for his lies, his cruelty for shattering something so precious with such careless hands. It was a paltry offering, a drop of remorse in an ocean of wreckage, but it was all he had left. He left the letter on the island, a final futile echo of a conversation he should have had a lifetime ago. Then, with a single suitcase containing the few things that were truly his, he walked out of the house for the last time. Marina, meanwhile, moved with the cool, swift efficiency of her newfound power. She never set foot in the brownstone again. Through Alistair, she gave the instructions: sell everything in it, liquidate it all. It was a place of ghosts and pain, the tombstone of a life she no longer wanted. With the reclaimed assets from her grandfather's trust, she didn't attempt to piece together her old world. She built a new one from the ground up. She bought a beautiful sun-drenched historic home in Cambridge, a place with a sprawling garden where Owen could play and tall windows that let the light pour in. She established the Finch and Dawson Arts Foundation in honor of her grandfather and Alistair's loyalty, creating a legacy of meaning. She poured her time and energy into her work, and most importantly, into her son. His laughter was the only sound that mattered, now the steady, happy rhythm of her new, uncompromised life. Several months later, a formal letter arrived from Lionel's new, far less prestigious lawyer. It was a humble request for a meeting not to discuss assets or legalities, but for a personal matter. After a week of consideration, she agreed. They met in a public park halfway between her new life and whatever was left of his. She saw him on a bench near the duck pond before he saw her. The impeccably tailored suits were gone, replaced by simple trousers and a worn jacket. The confident, predatory swagger had been replaced by a stoop in his shoulders. When he finally looked up and saw her approaching with Owen in her arms, the expression on his face was one of raw, unshielded pain. He stood awkwardly as she approached. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its former arrogance. "I'm here," she replied, her tone neutral. She did not sit. His eyes fell to the boy in her arms. Owen, curious and unafraid, looked back at him, his own hazel eyes wide. A choked sound escaped Lionel's throat. It was the first time he had seen his son up close in the clear light of day. He didn't ask for a second chance for her, for them. He seemed to know that was a door he had sealed shut forever. His request was smaller, more fragile. Can I know him?" he asked, his gaze fixed on Owen. "I don't expect to be a father, not in the way I should have been. I forfeited that right. But I'd like to see him, to be a small part of his life, if you'll let me. He deserves to know his father wasn't always a monster." Marina looked from Lionel's broken face to her son's innocent one. For a fleeting moment, the searing anger of his betrayal threatened to surface. The memory of Sienna's smug wave of being discarded like refuse was a scar that would never fully fade. It would be so easy to say no, to punish him forever, to deny him the one thing he now seemed to crave. But as she looked at Owen, she knew that vengeance was a poison. It would not heal her, and it might one day harm her son. "He can see you on weekends," she said, her voice steady and firm, a decision forged in the crucible of her own strength, not his weakness. "Supervised at first. We will see how it goes. But Lionel—" She met his eyes, ensuring he understood the absolute finality of her words. "You and I are over. That will never change." A tear traced a path down his cheek, the first she had ever seen him shed. "I know," he whispered, a universe of regret in those two words. "Thank you, Marina, for your mercy." She gave him a slight, final nod of acknowledgement. There was nothing more to say. She adjusted Owen in her arms, feeling his small, warm weight against her heart. She turned and began to walk away toward the sunlit patch of grass where other children were playing. She didn't look back. The sounds of the park, the distant laughter, the rustling leaves, the gentle quacking of the ducks were the soundtrack to her new beginning. Lionel Dawson remained on the bench, a solitary figure left in the cold ashes of a life he had incinerated himself forever, watching the woman and the son he had lost walk into a new dawn without him. This was a story of ultimate betrayal, but it was also a story of incredible resilience. It shows how the quietest person in the room can sometimes be the most powerful, and how the truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always find its way to the light. Marina's journey from a heartbroken wife to a triumphant, independent mother is a testament to the strength that can be forged in the fires of adversity. She didn't just get revenge. She got her life back on her own terms. What would you have done in Marina's place? Would you have been as calculated, or would you have walked away forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of strength and shocking twists resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a powerful drama, and subscribing to the channel for more stories that feel like they're ripped straight from real life. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a single gripping tale. Thank you for listening. Tonight, the glittering chandeliers of the Grand Ballroom at the St. Regis Hotel in New York City cast a blinding light on an unfolding drama worthy of a Hollywood blockbuster. Billionaire magnate Julian Thorne thought he had orchestrated every detail of this charity gala, from the meticulously chosen guest list to the strategically placed photographers. He'd even gone so far as to ensure one name, a name that haunted his every success, was conspicuously absent: his ex-wife, the formidable Isabella Sterling. But little did Julian know fate, and perhaps a touch of exquisite irony, had a different script in mind. As the city's elite mingled, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to the entrance as Isabella Sterling, the event's principal sponsor, made her grand entrance. The collective gasp was audible. Julian's carefully constructed wall of denial had just crumbled, revealing a story of ambition, betrayal, and the undeniable power of a woman scorned. Stay tuned as we delve into the intricate web of their past and the shocking events of this unforgettable night. The air in Julian Thorne's penthouse office overlooking Central Park crackled with the nervous energy of his assistant Emily Carter. Julian, a man whose steely gaze and sharp jawline spoke of ruthless ambition, paced behind his mahogany desk. The annual Children's Hope Gala, his pet project, and a significant social event on the New York calendar, was just days away. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every guest carefully vetted, except for one glaring omission. Emily Julian's voice was a low, controlled rumble confirm once more. Isabella Sterling is not on the guest list. Not as an individual, not as part of any corporate delegation, not under any alias. Emily, a bright young woman, usually unflappable under pressure, swallowed hard. Mr. Thorne, I have personally cross-referenced the entire list 3 times. Ms. Sterling's name does not appear anywhere. I've also flagged her company Sterling Enterprises to ensure no last-minute table purchases under their banner. A ghost of a smile touched Julian's lips. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the satisfied expression of a general who had successfully outmaneuvered his adversary. Isabella. Even her name tasted like ash in his mouth. 5 years had passed since their acrimonious divorce, a public spectacle fueled by accusations of infidelity, and a bitter battle over Thorne Industries, the empire he had painstakingly built. He had emerged victorious, bruised but unbroken, while Isabella had retreated, licking her wounds, and he'd assumed fading into obscurity. He had underestimated her. Over the past few years, whispers had reached Julian. Rumors of Isabella's shrewd investments, her burgeoning real estate portfolio, and the quiet but steady growth of Sterling Enterprises. He had dismissed them as wishful thinking, the desperate attempts of a wounded ego to regain relevance. But beneath the veneer of his confidence, a nagging unease had begun to fester. Isabella had always possessed a tenacity that bordered on frightening, and the sponsor's Emily Julian pressed his gaze sharp. Go through the list again. Every single corporate and individual donor. Emily's fingers flew across her keyboard. The list of benefactors for the gala was long and impressive, a testament to Julian's influence and the perceived prestige of the event. Names like the Vanderbilt Foundation, the Rothschild Investment Group, and numerous tech giants scrolled across her screen. Everything appears in order, Mr. Thorne Emily reported after a tense few minutes. The primary sponsors are the Thorne Foundation, of course, and then a consortium of smaller donors. She trailed off, her brow furrowed, and Julian's voice held a hint of impatience. There's a new entry, Mr. Thorne, a significant contribution made just last week. It's Sterling Enterprises. Julian's blood ran cold. It couldn't be. There had to be a mistake. Are you certain Emily double-checked the paperwork? The contact person? Everything? Emily's face was pale as she reread the details. The signatory is Isabella Sterling, Mr. Thorne. The donation is substantial enough to place Sterling Enterprises as a platinum-level sponsor, second only to the Thorne Foundation. A wave of disbelief, followed by a surge of icy fury, washed over Julian. Isabella, his ex-wife, the woman he had deliberately excluded, had not only managed to infiltrate his carefully controlled event, but had done so in a position of significant power and influence. This wasn't just about attending a gala. This was a calculated move, a public declaration of her resurgence. How did this happen? Julian's voice was tight with suppressed rage. Who authorized this sponsorship? The initial contact came through our development director, Mr. Davies. Emily explained, her voice barely above a whisper. He said the offer was unexpected, but generous, and, after verifying the legitimacy of Sterling Enterprises, he fast-tracked the agreement. He wasn't aware of the personal history, sir. Julian's mind raced. Davies was a seasoned professional, not prone to oversight. Isabella must have played her hand expertly, exploiting any potential blind spots. This wasn't just about charity. This was about making a statement, about reminding him and the entire city that she was still a force to be reckoned with. Emily Julian said, his voice dangerously low. I want you to find out everything. How Isabella managed this, who she spoke to, every single detail. And then I want you to discreetly try and mitigate the situation. See if there's any way to reallocate the sponsorship, perhaps offer Sterling Enterprises a lower tier, with less prominent visibility. Emily nodded quickly, her eyes wide with apprehension. She knew better than to argue with Julian when he was in this mood. The gala, which was supposed to be a celebration of philanthropy and Julian's continued success, was now poised to become a battleground. And Isabella Sterling had just fired the first shot. The days leading up to the Children's Hope Gala were a whirlwind of activity. Julian threw himself into the final preparations, attending endless meetings with caterers, security personnel, and the event's PR team. He tried to appear calm and in control, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The knowledge of Isabella's impending presence gnawed at him, stirring up long-buried emotions, resentment, anger, and a grudging respect for her audacity. Emily, under strict instructions to be discreet, had managed to piece together some of the puzzle. Isabella had approached the Thorne Foundation through a third-party representative, presenting the sponsorship as a genuine philanthropic endeavor by a newly revitalized Sterling Enterprises. The speed and efficiency of the transaction had caught everyone off guard. By the time anyone within Julian's inner circle realized the connection, the agreement was signed, and the funds had been transferred. Julian considered his options. He could try to publicly discredit Sterling Enterprises, but that would be messy and could backfire, potentially damaging the gala's reputation and his own. He could confront Isabella directly, but he knew that would likely only fuel her resolve. He could even try to buy her out of the sponsorship, but that would be an admission of defeat, a sign of weakness he couldn't afford to show. In the end, he decided to play it cool to maintain a facade of indifference. He would acknowledge Isabella's presence with polite civility, nothing more. He would not allow her to derail his event or his carefully constructed image. As the night of the gala arrived, the grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a spectacle of glittering gowns, impeccably tailored tuxedos, and the clinking of champagne glasses. The city's elite had turned out in force. Prominent business leaders, influential politicians, and a smattering of well-known celebrities. Julian, dressed in a classic black tuxedo, moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and posing for photographs. He was the picture of the successful and benevolent host. But as the evening progressed, a subtle shift began to occur. Whispers rippled through the room, hushed conversations held behind elegantly gloved hands. The topic of discussion, Isabella Sterling's unexpected sponsorship. Did you hear Lady Beatrice Harrington, a society doyenne, known for her extensive network of informants, murmured to her companion Arthur Finch, a renowned art collector. Isabella Sterling is a major sponsor tonight, Julian Thorne's ex-wife. Arthur's eyebrows shot up. The Isabella Sterling I thought she had all but disappeared after the divorce. Apparently not, Beatrice said, with a knowing smile. Rumor has it, Sterling Enterprises has been quietly making waves. This gala sponsorship is quite the statement, wouldn't you agree? Across the room, similar conversations were taking place. The unexpected twist had injected a jolt of intrigue into an otherwise predictable social event. People were speculating about Isabella's motives, her current standing, and of course the potential for an awkward encounter with her ex-husband. Julian, despite his attempts to remain aloof, was acutely aware of the undercurrent of gossip. He saw the curious glances, the subtle nudges, the hushed whispers that followed him as he moved through the room. He knew that the narrative of the evening was shifting, and he was no longer entirely in control of the story. He caught Emily's eye and gestured for her to join him. "What's the buzz, Emily?" he asked, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel. "So everyone is talking about Miss Sterling's sponsorship." Emily admitted, her face pale. "There's a lot of speculation. Speculation about what exactly about her intentions, sir, and about how you feel about it." Julian forced a smile. Tell everyone I am delighted to have Sterling Enterprises as a sponsor. Their generous contribution will make a significant difference to the children we are supporting." He knew his words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Just then, the master of ceremonies, a well-known television personality named Charles Graham, stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming through the ballroom, "please take your seats. Dinner will be served shortly, followed by our program for the evening." As the guests began to find their tables, Julian scanned the room, his eyes searching for a familiar face. He hadn't seen Isabella yet, and a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation churned in his stomach. He told himself he was simply curious, that he wanted to gauge the situation. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He was waiting for her. The ballroom buzzed with conversation as waiters in crisp white uniforms began serving the first course. Julian found himself seated at the head table, flanked by prominent philanthropists and city officials. He engaged in polite conversation, forcing himself to focus on the present, but his attention kept drifting towards the main entrance. Then a hush began to fall over the room. It started subtly, a gradual quieting of voices, but it spread quickly like a ripple effect. All heads began to turn towards the doorway. And then she appeared. Isabella Sterling stood in the entrance, bathed in the soft glow of the foyer lights. She was a vision in a stunning emerald green gown that shimmered with every movement. The dress, a custom creation by renowned designer Vivian Holloway, featured a plunging neckline and a dramatic train that trailed behind her like liquid moonlight. Her dark hair was styled in an elegant updo, revealing a pair of dazzling diamond earrings. She moved with a grace and confidence that commanded attention, her eyes sweeping across the room, acknowledging no one in particular, yet somehow making everyone feel seen. Julian felt a jolt, a visceral reaction he hadn't expected. He had seen Isabella countless times over the years in casual clothes and formal attire, laughing and arguing, vulnerable and strong. But he had never seen her like this. There was a regal quality about her tonight, an aura of power and self-possession that was both captivating and intimidating. As Isabella stepped fully into the ballroom, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew who she was. Everyone knew the history. And everyone knew that her presence here as a major sponsor was no accident. Charles Graham, the master of ceremonies, seemed momentarily flustered. He quickly regained his composure and announced, his voice slightly louder than necessary. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of our esteemed platinum sponsors for this evening, Ms. Isabella Sterling." A smattering of polite applause broke out, but it was hesitant, overshadowed by the palpable tension in the room. People were unsure how to react. Was this a reconciliation? A confrontation? A deliberate act of defiance? Isabella acknowledged the applause with a gracious nod and began to walk towards her designated table. It was strategically located near the front, offering her a clear view of the stage, and more importantly, of Julian. As she made her way through the room, something unexpected happened. One by one, guests began to rise from their tables. It started with a few, then more, until the entire ballroom was on its feet. It wasn't a planned standing ovation. It was a spontaneous reaction, a mixture of respect, curiosity, and perhaps even a touch of rebellious admiration for a woman who had dared to walk into the lion's den with such poise and confidence. Julian watched in stunned silence as his carefully curated guest list paid an unspoken tribute to his ex-wife. He remained seated, his hands clenched beneath the table, his face a mask of carefully controlled neutrality. Inside, however, a maelstrom of emotions raged. He felt humiliated, outmaneuvered, and strangely, impressed. Isabella reached her table and acknowledged the standing ovation with a serene smile. She sat down, her gaze briefly meeting Julian's across the room. There was no malice in her eyes, no triumph, just a quiet knowing that spoke volumes. The room slowly began to settle, the guests resuming their seats with a renewed sense of anticipation. The energy in the ballroom had shifted. The focus was no longer solely on Julian Thorne, the benevolent host. Now all eyes were on Isabella Sterling, the unexpected guest of honor, the woman who had turned his carefully orchestrated evening into a real-life drama. The game had changed, and Julian knew with a sinking feeling that Isabella had just made her most powerful move. The dinner service continued, but the atmosphere in the grand ballroom had irrevocably changed. The polite chatter had become more subdued, punctuated by nervous glances towards Isabella's table and furtive whispers. Julian tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, engaging in conversation with the dignitaries seated beside him. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying Isabella's entrance and the subsequent standing ovation. He couldn't deny the impact of her arrival. It was more than just a social faux pas. It was a power play executed with flawless precision. She hadn't stormed in, causing a scene. She had simply arrived elegant and self-assured and allowed the sheer audacity of her presence to speak for itself. Across the room, Isabella held court at her table, surrounded by a group of equally well-dressed and influential individuals. She laughed easily, her conversation animated, giving no outward indication of the undercurrent of tension that permeated the room. But Julian, who knew her better than anyone, could sense the subtle undercurrent of steel beneath her polished exterior. This wasn't just about enjoying a charity gala. This was about reclaiming her narrative. Later in the evening, after the main course had been cleared, Charles Graham returned to the stage to introduce the program for the night, a series of speeches highlighting the work of the Children's Hope Foundation, followed by a live auction. Julian delivered his prepared remarks, speaking passionately about the importance of their mission, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his words were falling somewhat flat. The audience's attention seemed divided, their curiosity about the unfolding drama overshadowing their focus on the cause. As the auction began, Julian watched as Isabella actively participated, bidding generously on several high-value items. Each successful bid drew applause and admiring glances, further solidifying her presence as a significant player in the room, both philanthropically and socially. He found himself wanting to know what she was thinking, what her ultimate goal was. Was this about revenge, about proving her success? Or was it something else entirely? The years since their divorce had created a chasm between them, filled with unanswered questions and unspoken resentments. Tonight, that chasm felt more vast than ever. During a brief intermission, Julian found himself cornered by Eleanor Vance, a prominent society columnist, known for her sharp wit and even sharper pen. Julian darling, she purred, her eyes gleaming with undisguised curiosity. What a delightful surprise to see Isabella here tonight. Such a generous sponsor. A true testament to the power of forgiveness, wouldn't you say? Julian forced a tight smile. Indeed, Eleanor. We are grateful for Sterling Enterprises' support. Of course, darling. Eleanor continued, her gaze unwavering. And what a statement she made with that entrance. Quite the showstopper. Isabella always had a flair for the dramatic, Julian replied, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor chuckled. That she did. One wonders what the next act will be. With that, she patted his arm and moved on, leaving Julian feeling like a specimen under a microscope. He needed a moment to himself. He slipped away from the main ballroom and found refuge in a quiet anteroom. The opulent decor, velvet drapes, antique furniture, did little to soothe his frayed nerves. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly. Just as he was trying to compose himself, the door to the anteroom opened, and Isabella walked in. For a moment they stood in silence, the only sound the faint murmur of conversation from the ballroom. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, a legacy of their shared past. Isabella broke the silence. "Julian," she said, her voice calm and composed. "Isabella," he replied, his tone carefully measured. "I must say," she continued, a hint of a smile playing on her lips, "you seem surprised to see me." "Frankly, yes," Julian admitted. "I wasn't aware that Sterling Enterprises would be such a significant sponsor." "I made the arrangements recently," she said simply. "I believe in the work of the Children's Hope Foundation." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Philanthropy. That's your primary motivation." Isabella's smile faded. "My motivations are my own, Julian. But let's just say that I believe in supporting worthy causes. And perhaps in making my presence felt." Their eyes met, and in that moment, years of unspoken words seemed to hang between them. There was hurt resentment, but also a flicker of something else, a recognition of the bond that had once existed between them. "You certainly achieved that," Julian said, his voice low. The standing ovation was quite theatrical. The reaction of your guests was their own. Julian, Isabella replied, her tone firm. "I simply walked into a room you knew you weren't exactly invited to," he countered. "I was invited as a sponsor," she corrected him. "A platinum-level sponsor. My invitation was as valid as anyone else's in this room." The silence returned thick with unspoken accusations and lingering emotions. Julian knew that this chance encounter was just the beginning. Isabella's presence at the gala was not just a fleeting moment. It was a declaration, a sign that their paths were destined to cross again in ways neither of them could have fully predicted. The tension between Julian and Isabella remained palpable throughout the rest of the evening, though they largely avoided direct interaction. Julian busied himself with his hosting duties, while Isabella continued to engage with the other guests, her charm and intelligence clearly making a positive impression. As the gala drew to a close, Julian found himself cornered by Arthur Finch, the art collector he had seen speaking with Lady Beatrice earlier. "Julian, my boy Arthur," said, his eyes twinkling. "Fascinating evening." "Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Arthur," Julian replied, trying to sound enthusiastic. And Isabella Arthur continued, undeterred. "What a remarkable woman. I had no idea Sterling Enterprises had become such a force." "They've been busy," Julian said curtly. "Indeed," Arthur mused. "We were just discussing her recent acquisition of the old Hawthorne building downtown. Prime real estate. A very shrewd move." Julian's blood ran cold. The Hawthorne building had been a property he had been eyeing for years, a key piece in his long-term development plans. He had assumed it was still tied up in legal wrangling. Isabella had not only re-emerged as a financial powerhouse, but was now directly competing with him in the business world. Just then, Isabella approached their small group. "Arthur, it was lovely speaking with you earlier," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "The pleasure was all mine, my dear," Arthur replied, his gaze admiring. "I was just complimenting Julian on your impressive business acumen." Isabella's eyes flickered to Julian, a subtle challenge in their depths. "Thank you, Arthur. I believe in seizing opportunities when they arise. A trait you clearly share with Julian," Arthur said, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. "Perhaps you two should collaborate on a project sometime." Think of the synergy. Julian and Isabella exchanged a strained glance. Collaboration was the furthest thing from their minds. As Arthur moved away to speak with another guest, Julian turned to Isabella. The Hawthorne building, he asked, his voice tight. A very promising investment, she replied, her tone deliberately nonchalant. I was under the impression that property was unavailable. Sometimes things become available to those who are persistent, she said, her gaze unwavering. Julian realized that Isabella's sponsorship of the gala wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger strategy, a calculated re-entry into the world she had been forced to leave, and she was not afraid to compete with him directly. The following week brought a series of unexpected developments. Several prominent members of Julian's inner circle, trusted advisors and long-time associates, quietly reached out to Isabella requesting meetings. He learned through the grapevine that she had been receiving them, listening intently to their proposals and ideas. He couldn't fathom what she was up to. Was she trying to poach his people, undermine his business, or was there something else at play? One afternoon, Emily came into his office, her face troubled. "Mr. Thorne," she said hesitantly, "I've received some unusual requests." "What kind of requests?" Julian asked, his patience wearing thin. "Several of our major investors have inquired about the possibility of diversifying their portfolios with Sterling Enterprises." Julian stared at her in disbelief. Isabella was not only competing with him, she was actively attracting his investors. This was no longer just about social maneuvering. This was a full-scale business war. He knew he had to act, and he had to act decisively. He couldn't afford to underestimate Isabella any longer. She was no longer the wounded ex-wife he had dismissed. She was a formidable opponent, and she was coming for him. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Catherine," he said, his voice grim. "I need your help." Catherine Davies was a notorious corporate strategist, known for her ruthlessness and her ability to turn any situation to her client's advantage. Julian had hired her during his divorce proceedings, and she had played a crucial role in his victory. Now he needed her expertise again. The game had changed, and he needed a new weapon in his arsenal. He had no idea what Isabella's next move would be, but he knew he had to be prepared. The battle for control, both social and corporate, had officially begun. Julian's decision to bring Catherine Davies back into his fold marked a significant shift in his approach. He was no longer content to simply react to Isabella's moves. He was ready to go on the offensive. Catherine, with her sharp intellect and her reputation for playing hardball, was the perfect strategist to help him counter Isabella's growing influence. Their initial meetings were intense brainstorming sessions, analyzing Isabella's recent activities and trying to predict her next steps. Catherine was particularly interested in Isabella's acquisition of the Hawthorne building. "That property is key." "Julian," she explained, pacing around his office, "it's not just about the real estate itself. It's about the message it sends. It shows that Isabella is serious, that she's here to stay, and that she's not afraid to go head-to-head with you. I need to find a way to undermine that deal." Julian said, his jaw tight. "Find any weakness, any loophole." Catherine shook her head. "That would be too obvious, Julian. And it could backfire. We need a more strategic approach. We need to show that Thorne Industries is still the dominant force, the one investors should be betting on." Their plan began to take shape. Julian, under Catherine's guidance, launched a series of high-profile initiatives. A major expansion into a new market, a groundbreaking technological innovation, and a significant philanthropic pledge that dwarfed Isabella's gala sponsorship. The message was clear. Thorne Industries was thriving, innovating, and committed to growth. Meanwhile, Catherine began to work behind the scenes, subtly reminding investors of Julian's long track record of success and the stability of Thorne Industries compared to the relatively new Sterling Enterprises. She didn't directly criticize Isabella, but she skillfully planted seeds of doubt, highlighting the risks associated with investing in a less established company. The battle for public perception was fierce. The business media closely followed every move, fueling the narrative of a high-stakes rivalry between the former spouses. Julian and Isabella became the subjects of countless articles, speculating on their motivations and predicting the outcome of their silent war. Isabella, for her part, remained outwardly unfazed by Julian's counteroffensive. Sterling Enterprises continued to pursue its own growth strategy, securing new deals and attracting a steady stream of investors. She even announced a major partnership with a leading international firm, further solidifying her company's credibility. Julian found himself increasingly frustrated by Isabella's resilience. Every move he made seemed to be met with an equally strategic response. He had underestimated her ambition and her ability to play the game. One evening, Catherine called Julian with an intriguing piece of information. "Julian," she said, her voice low, "I've been looking into the financing behind Isabella's acquisition of the Hawthorne building. It seems she secured a significant loan from a relatively unknown investment group." Unknown how Julian asked, his interest piqued. As in, they have very little public presence, no major deals, no significant portfolio. It's almost as if they appeared out of nowhere. Julian felt a flicker of possibility. "Do you think there's something unusual about them?" "It's worth looking into," Catherine replied. "I'm digging deeper, but it's possible Isabella's financial backing isn't as solid as it appears." Catherine's investigation led her down a rabbit hole of shell corporations and offshore accounts. The investment group that had financed Isabella's Hawthorne building purchase was indeed shadowy, their origins and true ownership deliberately obscured. Catherine's instincts told her that there was more to this story than met the eye. She finally uncovered a crucial link. The primary investor behind the mysterious group had a long and complicated history of unethical business practices and was currently under investigation by several international regulatory bodies. If this connection became public, it could severely damage Isabella's reputation and potentially jeopardize the Hawthorne building deal. Julian knew this was a risky move. Exposing Isabella's potential ties to such a disreputable figure could be seen as a desperate attempt to undermine her success, but the opportunity was too significant to ignore. Under Catherine's guidance, Julian carefully leaked the information to a trusted investigative journalist. The story broke the following week, sending shockwaves through the business world. Headlines screamed about Isabella's controversial financing, and questions were raised about her due diligence and judgment. The fallout was immediate. Several of Sterling Enterprises' recent deals were put on hold, and some investors began to express concern. The carefully crafted image of Isabella as a savvy and ethical business leader was suddenly under threat. Julian watched the unfolding events with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. He had landed a significant blow, but he knew that Isabella was not one to back down easily. He braced himself for her inevitable counterattack. He had thrown down the gauntlet, and he knew that the final act of their high-stakes drama was about to begin. The exposé on Isabella's financing sent a tremor through her carefully constructed world. Sterling Enterprises faced intense scrutiny, and the future of the Hawthorne building project hung in the balance. Julian watched with a sense of grim satisfaction, believing he had finally gained the upper hand. However, Isabella's response was not what he expected. Instead of lashing out or retreating, she addressed the allegations head-on. She issued a public statement, acknowledging the concerns, vowing to conduct a thorough internal review of the financing arrangements. She emphasized her commitment to transparency and ethical business practices, and while she didn't explicitly sever ties with the controversial investment group, she made it clear that she would take swift action if any wrongdoing was uncovered. Her calm and measured response seemed to quell some of the initial panic. While the cloud of suspicion remained, Many admired her handling of the crisis. Julian had expected a fight, but Isabella had chosen a different path, one that surprised and frankly impressed him. Then came the unexpected twist. Catherine Davies, Julian's own formidable strategist, received a discreet message requesting a meeting. The sender, Isabella Sterling. Intrigued and slightly suspicious, Catherine agreed. They met in a neutral location, a quiet corner of a high-end hotel lobby. "Ms. Davies." Isabella began, her tone direct, but polite. "Thank you for meeting with me." Ms. Sterling, Catherine, replied, her expression carefully neutral. "I know you were instrumental in uncovering the information about my financing," Isabella continued. "And while I won't pretend that it hasn't caused significant challenges for Sterling Enterprises, I also understand that you were simply doing your job." Catherine remained silent, waiting for Isabella's point. "What you may not know," Isabella said, her gaze steady, "is that I was also unaware of the full extent of the primary investor's questionable background. The deal was structured through several layers of intermediaries, and the information was deliberately obscured." Catherine raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in her eyes. "I realize this may sound convenient," Isabella said, anticipating Catherine's doubt. "But I assure you, I am taking this matter extremely seriously. I have already initiated legal proceedings to extricate Sterling Enterprises from the agreement." Then Isabella made an unexpected proposition. "Ms. Davies, you are known for your strategic brilliance. I would like to offer you a consulting role to help Sterling Enterprises navigate this situation and ensure that we emerge stronger and more transparent than before." Catherine was taken aback. This was the last thing she had expected. "Why would you offer me this?" Catherine asked, her voice carefully controlled. "I work for Julian Thorne. We are by definition adversaries." "Precisely," Isabella replied, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You know Julian's strategies, his weaknesses, his strengths, and I have no doubt that your loyalty to him is unwavering. But I also believe that you value integrity and a good challenge. This situation requires a delicate and strategic approach, and I believe your expertise would be invaluable." Catherine was silent for a long moment, considering Isabella's offer. It was audacious, unexpected, and potentially brilliant. "I will need to think about this, Ms. Sterling," Catherine finally said. "Of course," Isabella replied. "But consider this, perhaps it's time for a different kind of alliance. One based not on animosity, but on mutual respect, and a shared commitment to finding the best possible outcome." Catherine returned to Julian with the details of her meeting with Isabella. Julian was stunned by the offer. He saw it as a clever ploy, an attempt by Isabella to gain inside information and undermine him further. He vehemently opposed Catherine even considering the proposal. "She's trying to play you," Catherine, Julian insisted. "Don't fall for it." But Catherine saw something different in Isabella's offer. She saw an opportunity to understand her opponent better, to potentially influence the situation in a way that would ultimately benefit Julian, albeit indirectly. After much deliberation, Catherine accepted Isabella's offer with the caveat that her primary loyalty remained with Julian. She began working with Sterling Enterprises, helping them to restructure their financing and implement stricter due diligence procedures. The collaboration between Catherine and Isabella was kept largely secret. To the outside world, the rivalry between Julian and Isabella appeared to continue. But behind the scenes, a subtle shift was taking place. As Catherine worked closely with Isabella, she began to gain a new perspective on her former adversary. She saw her intelligence, her resilience, and her genuine commitment to building a successful and ethical business. She also came to understand the extent to which Isabella had been blindsided by the actions of the rogue investor. Catherine eventually brokered a resolution that allowed Sterling Enterprises to secure new reputable financing for the Hawthorne Building project, albeit under stricter terms. The scandal faded from the headlines, and Isabella emerged with her reputation bruised but intact. One evening, Catherine met with Julian to update him on the situation. "The Hawthorne Building project is back on track," she reported. "Isabella has secured new financing, and the controversy is starting to die down." Julian listened intently, a grudging respect in his eyes. "She handled this well," he admitted. "She did," Catherine agreed. "And I believe she has learned a valuable lesson." Then Catherine revealed the full extent of her involvement with Sterling Enterprises. Julian was initially furious, feeling betrayed. But Catherine calmly explained her reasoning, emphasizing that her actions had ultimately helped to stabilize the situation and prevent a potentially damaging and prolonged public battle. As Julian considered Catherine's words, he began to see the wisdom in her approach. The rivalry with Isabella had been consuming him, diverting his attention from his own business goals. Perhaps it was time for a truce, a recognition that they could both be successful without constantly trying to undermine each other. A few weeks later, Julian received a personal invitation from Isabella. Sterling Enterprises was hosting a small private reception to celebrate the new financing for the Hawthorne Building. To his surprise, he accepted. When he arrived at the reception, Isabella greeted him warmly. There was no trace of animosity in her eyes, only a quiet understanding. "Julian," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming." "Isabella," he replied, shaking her hand. "Congratulations on securing the new financing." They spoke for a while, not about their past, but about their future business endeavors. There was a newfound respect between them, a recognition of their shared ambition and resilience. The rivalry hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had evolved. It was no longer a bitter feud fueled by resentment, but a more measured competition, perhaps even one with a hint of mutual admiration. The billionaire who had tried to block his ex-wife's name had ultimately found himself in an unexpected truce, a testament to the fact that even the most dramatic real-life stories can take unforeseen turns. 3 months passed. The fragile truce between Julian Thorne and Isabella Sterling settled into an unspoken, carefully observed protocol. The New York business world, which had been transfixed by their public feud, now watched with a different kind of fascination. They were no longer combatants in a gladiatorial arena, but two formidable lions circling the same territory, acknowledging each other's power with a wary but undeniable respect. They competed, yes, fiercely for contracts, for properties, for talent. But the cutthroat edge was gone. The attacks were no longer personal, the victories no longer celebrated as conquests over a fallen foe. Julian found the change unsettlingly peaceful. His days were less consumed by paranoia and more by pure strategy. He found himself analyzing Isabella's business moves not as personal affronts, but as brilliant plays in a complex game he was privileged to be a part of. He saw her at a tech conference in Soho, commanding a room of venture capitalists with the same poise she had displayed at the gala. Their eyes met across the crowded floor. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She returned it. It was a silent acknowledgement, a recognition that they were peers, titans in their own right. The first tremor came not as a thunderclap, but as a series of strange, disconnected anomalies. A key shipping route for Thorne Industries' European imports was suddenly choked by a string of inexplicable regulatory hurdles in a small Baltic port. A week later, one of Sterling Enterprises' most promising green energy startups in South America was hit with a crippling, politically motivated lawsuit from a previously unknown environmental group. Julian initially saw it as the cost of doing business on a global scale. He dispatched his legal team to handle the port issue, dismissing it as bureaucratic red tape. Isabella likewise viewed the lawsuit as an aggressive but manageable challenge, a shakedown by a local faction looking for a payout. Neither saw the connection. It was Catherine Davies who first pieced the fragments together. She had maintained her unique consulting role, a bridge between the two empires, and her vantage point gave her a perspective neither Julian nor Isabella possessed. She was in Julian's office, a holographic map of global supply chains glowing in the center of the room, when her tablet chimed with an alert. "That's odd," she murmured, her brow furrowing. She cross-referenced the alert with a file she had open. "Julian, the holding company that owns the port authority in Latvia, the one causing you so much trouble." "What about them?" Julian asked, his attention focused on rerouting his cargo through Germany. And Ms. Sterling Catherine continued, her voice gaining a sharp edge, the Shell Corporation funding the lawsuit against her startup in Brazil. They both trace back to the same obscure financial entity registered in Cyprus. Julian turned from the map, his full attention now on Catherine. And that entity, as Catherine's face, was grim. She tapped a final command into her tablet, and a name appeared on the screen, stark and menacing. It's a subsidiary of a private equity firm controlled by Victor Orloff. The name landed in the room like a grenade. Victor Orloff, the shadowy financier whose reputation was a cocktail of ruthlessness and corruption, the man whose money had almost derailed Isabella's entire comeback, the man they had both embarrassed by exposing and severing his financial ties. "He's retaliating," Julian said, his voice a low growl. The implications clicked into place with terrifying speed. This wasn't random bad luck. It was a coordinated, multi-pronged attack. Orloff wasn't just coming for one of them. He was coming for both. Isabella reached the same conclusion a few hours later. Her own intelligence team had followed the money trail from the Brazilian lawsuit and arrived at the same venomous source, Orloff. Her first instinct was a familiar one, to fortify her defenses, to fight this battle alone. She had rebuilt her empire by herself, and she would defend it by herself. Trusting Julian Thorne, even in this new era of civility, felt like a bridge too far. Orloff was her problem. She had brought his money into her company, however unknowingly. But as the day wore on, the scope of Orloff's attack became clearer. A whisper campaign started among her investors, seeding doubts about her leadership. A key supplier for the Hawthorne building project abruptly pulled out, citing unforeseen financial difficulties that felt anything but unforeseen. She realized with a chilling certainty that Orloff wasn't just trying to punish her. He was trying to dismantle her piece by piece, and he was using his vast, invisible network to attack her on fronts she couldn't possibly defend all at once. That evening, her private line rang. It was Catherine Davies. "He's targeting Julian with equal force," Catherine said without preamble. "A hostile short-selling attack on Thorne Industries' tech stock is being prepared as we speak. Orloff is trying to bleed you both dry, counting on the fact that you'll be too busy watching each other to see him coming for you both." There was a long pause. Isabella walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of her office, looking out at the glittering tapestry of the city. She could see the Thorne Tower, its spire piercing the clouds, a monument to the man who was once her entire world and then her greatest enemy. "What are you suggesting?" Catherine Isabella asked, though she already knew the answer. "A meeting. You and Julian. Tonight. My office. This is bigger than your rivalry. This is about survival." The atmosphere in Catherine Davies's minimalist downtown office was thick enough to taste. Julian stood by the window, his back to the door, arms crossed. Isabella entered her posture, radiating a tense calm. They hadn't been alone in a room together since that brief, charged encounter at the gala. "Isabella," Julian said, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable. "Julian," she replied, her voice steady. Catherine closed the door, leaving them to it. For a moment, the silence was a chasm filled with 5 years of bitterness, divorce proceedings, public humiliation, and a rivalry that had defined them both. Julian spoke first. "Orlov thinks he can play us against each other. He thinks we'll be so focused on our old war that we won't have the resources to fight a new one. He's using our history as his primary weapon," Isabella agreed, taking a seat at the polished chrome conference table. "He'll hit you expecting me to see it as an opportunity. He'll hit me expecting you to stand back and watch me fall. And a part of you wants to, doesn't it?" Julian's question was blunt, stripped of all pretense. "A part of you sees Thorn Industries taking a hit and thinks he deserves it." Isabella met his gaze without flinching. "Does a part of you not feel the same? After everything, it would be naive to pretend those feelings simply vanish." Her honesty was disarming. "But what I feel is irrelevant. Viktor Orlov is a predator. If he takes one of us down, the other is next. He won't stop until he's picked both our bones clean, simply to prove a point." Julian walked to the table and sat opposite her. The space between them felt like a negotiating table and a battlefield all at once. "So what do we do?" he asked. "We fight him," Isabella said simply. "Separately we're vulnerable," Julian reasoned, thinking aloud. "His network is too diffuse. I have the corporate muscle, the established power. You have agility, a network of newer, more disruptive allies. You can move in circles I can't. I can leverage weight you don't have." He paused, the unspoken proposition hanging in the air between them. It was a radical, unthinkable idea, an idea that went against every instinct they had honed over the past 5 years. An alliance, Isabella voiced the word, testing its weight. "You and me, Sterling Enterprises and Thorn Industries, a united front. It's insane," Julian admitted. "It's the only move he won't see coming." She countered, a spark of the old fire in her eyes. "He's banking on our division. The most powerful thing we can do is present him with our unity." The implications were staggering. It would mean sharing sensitive information, trusting each other's intel, coordinating strategies. It would mean placing their destinies and the fate of their empires in the hands of the one person they had once trusted above all others, and who had subsequently caused them the most profound pain. Julian stared at her, really seeing her not as the woman who had left, or the rival who had reappeared, but as the brilliant, formidable strategist she had always been. He saw the same fierce intelligence that had first captivated him all those years ago. "There would have to be rules," he said, his voice dropping into a business-like tone. "A formal agreement, clear lines of communication. No independent actions on this matter without consultation." "Agreed," Isabella said, leaning forward. "Complete transparency on all intelligence related to Orlov. We pool our resources, legal, financial, and cybersecurity. We designate Catherine as the official liaison to mitigate any direct friction." And when it's over, Julian asked the question, hanging heavy. When Orlov is dealt with, Isabella's expression softened for a fraction of a second. "When it's over," she said, "we dissolve the alliance and go back to being competitors." She held his gaze. "But perhaps competitors who understand that there are far more dangerous monsters in the world than the devil you know." Julian stood up and extended his hand across the table. It was a gesture that felt both monumental and terrifyingly uncertain. After a heartbeat's hesitation, Isabella stood and took it. Her grip was firm, her hand cool. It wasn't a handshake of reconciliation or forgiveness. It was the handshake of two sovereigns, two lions forging an alliance not out of affection, but out of a mutual and grudging respect for each other's power, and a shared instinct for survival. The war with Victor Orloff had begun, and for the first time in years, Julian Thorne and Isabella Sterling were on the same side. The saga of Julian Thorne and Isabella Sterling is a potent reminder that life, much like the most captivating dramas, is full of unexpected twists and turns. Julian's attempt to erase Isabella from his carefully curated world backfired spectacularly, leading to a public showdown at his own charity gala. Isabella's powerful entrance and the subsequent standing ovation served as a potent symbol of her resilience and the undeniable force of a woman determined to reclaim her narrative. The ensuing battle for social and corporate dominance was a roller coaster of strategic maneuvers and calculated risks, culminating in the surprising alliance forged by Catherine Davies. This unlikely partnership ultimately led to a fragile but significant truce between Julian and Isabella, a recognition that their shared history, though fraught with conflict, didn't have to define their future. Their story, filled with ambition, betrayal, and the ultimate emergence of respect, underscores the complexities of human relationships and the ever-shifting dynamics of power. It leaves us contemplating the true nature of success and the unexpected paths to resolution. If you enjoyed this dramatic tale of ambition and resilience, please give this video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories. Your support helps us bring more real-life dramas to your screen. What did you think of Isabella's unexpected entrance? And were you surprised by the truce? Let us know in the comments below.